I never thought it would happen to me. Not to us. Not after everything we'd been through. My name is Daniel Carter, and this is the story of how my life was shattered, rebuilt, and ultimately reclaimed. It's a story of love, betrayal, revenge, and redemption. But let me start at the beginning. I met Emily in college at the University of Texas. She was everything I wasn't, outgoing, spontaneous, and full of life. I was the quiet, introverted guy who spent most of his time buried in books or tinkering with computers. Somehow, she saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. We were opposites, but we balanced each other out. She brought color to my world, and I gave her stability. It was perfect. We got married 5 years after graduation in a small ceremony in Austin. I still remember the way she looked that day, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, her green eyes sparkling with joy. We promised each other forever, and I meant every word. For years, it felt like we were living a dream. We bought a house in the suburbs, adopted a golden retriever named Max, and talked about starting a family. Life was good, but then things started to change. Emily became distant. She'd come home late from work, claiming overtime or girls' nights out. Her phone, which she used to leave lying around, was suddenly always in her hand or face down on the table. I told myself it was nothing, that she was just stressed, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. She came home at midnight, her hair disheveled and her clothes smelling like a bar. I confronted her, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "Emily, where have you been?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady. She avoided my eyes, brushing past me to pour herself a glass of water. "I told you, Dan. I was out with the girls. Why are you being paranoid?" I snapped. "You've been acting strange for weeks. You're never home, and when you are, you're glued to your phone. What's going on?" She turned to face me, her expression hardening. "Maybe if you weren't so boring, I wouldn't need to go out all the time. Did you ever think about that?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stood there, stunned, as she stormed upstairs and slammed the bedroom door. That night, I slept on the couch, my mind racing with doubts and fears. Was she cheating on me? Was our marriage falling apart? I didn't want to believe it, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. The next morning, Emily acted like nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work, her usual cheerful self. I wanted to believe it was just a rough patch, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That's when I decided to find out the truth. I called in sick to work and spent the day setting up a plan. I installed a tracking app on her phone, something I never thought I'd do. I felt guilty, but I needed to know. If she was innocent, I'd delete it and never mention it again. But if she wasn't, well, I didn't want to think about that. That evening, Emily came home late again. She was all smiles, talking about a new project at work. I played along, pretending everything was fine. But inside, I was a mess. I waited until she fell asleep, then quietly grabbed her phone and checked the tracking app. My heart sank as I saw the location history. She hadn't been at work or out with friends. She'd been at a hotel downtown, a place I recognized all too well. It was where we'd spent our wedding night. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My hands shook as I scrolled through the data, seeing the same hotel pop up again and again over the past month. I wanted to scream, to break something, to confront her right then and there, but I didn't. Instead, I put her phone back and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her sleeping form. How could she do this to me? To us? I thought about all the years we'd spent together, all the promises we'd made. Was it all a lie? I felt a surge of anger, but also something else, a cold, calculating determination. If she wanted to play games, I'd play too, but I'd win. The next morning, I acted like nothing was wrong. I kissed her goodbye, told her to have a good day, and waited until she left for work. Then I got to work myself. I called a private investigator, a guy named Frank who came highly recommended. I gave him all the information I had and told him to dig deeper. I needed to know everything, who she was seeing, how long it had been going on, and most importantly, why. Frank called me back a few days later with the details. The man's name was Jason Miller, a co-worker of Emily's. They'd been having an affair for 6 months. 6 months, half a year of lies and deceit. I felt sick to my stomach, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to think clearly if I was going to get through this. That night, I confronted Emily again. This time, I was ready. "I know about Jason," I said, my voice cold and steady. She froze, her face pale. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Emily. I know everything. The hotel, the texts, the lies. How could you do this to me?" For a moment, she looked like she might deny it, but then her shoulders slumped and she started to cry. "I'm sorry, Dan. I never meant to hurt you. It just happened. It just happened," I repeated, my voice rising. "You don't accidentally sleep with someone for 6 months, Emily. You made a choice, and now you're going to live with the consequences." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "What are you going to do?" I didn't answer. Instead, I walked out the door, leaving her alone in the house we'd built together. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I didn't go back home that night. Instead, I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The room smelled like stale cigarettes and desperation, but it was better than facing Emily. I needed time to think, to process everything. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, sadness, betrayal, and a strange, almost clinical determination. I wasn't going to let this destroy me. If anything, it was going to make me stronger. I spent the next few days in that motel room, plotting my next move. I didn't want to just walk away from the marriage. That would be too easy for her. No, I wanted her to feel the same pain she'd inflicted on me. I wanted her to regret ever crossing me, but I also knew I had to be smart about it. I couldn't let my emotions cloud my judgment. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. The first step was to gather evidence. I needed proof of the affair, not just for my own peace of mind, but for the divorce proceedings. I knew Emily would try to spin this in her favor, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I called Frank, the private investigator, and asked him to dig deeper. I wanted photos, emails, text messages, anything that could prove her infidelity. While Frank worked his magic, I focused on my own investigation. I started by going through our finances. Emily and I had a joint account, but I also had a separate savings account that she didn't know about. I transferred most of our shared funds into that account, leaving just enough to avoid raising suspicion. I also canceled her credit cards and froze her access to our investments. If she thought she could walk away with half of everything, she was in for a rude awakening. Next, I turned my attention to Jason. I needed to know everything about him, his job, his family, his weaknesses. I couldn't confront him directly, not yet, but I could make his life miserable in other ways. I created a fake social media profile and started following him online. I learned that he was married, with 2 young kids. His wife, Sarah, seemed like a sweet woman, completely unaware of her husband's double life. That gave me an idea. I reached out to Sarah anonymously, sending her a message with just enough information to pique her curiosity. I didn't want to come on too strong, but I needed her to start asking questions. It didn't take long for her to respond. "Who is this?" she wrote back. "And what are you talking about?" I hesitated for a moment, then typed out my reply. "I'm someone who knows your husband isn't who he says he is. If you want the truth, meet me at the Starbucks on 5th Street tomorrow at noon. Come alone." The next day, I watched from a distance as Sarah walked into the coffee shop. She looked nervous, glancing around as she ordered her drink. I waited until she sat down before approaching her table. "Sarah?" I said, keeping my voice low. She looked up, her eyes wide with suspicion. "Yes? Who are you?" "My name doesn't matter," I said, sitting down across from her. "What matters is what I have to tell you about your husband." I handed her a manila folder filled with photos and printouts of text messages between Jason and Emily. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the evidence, her face growing paler with each page. This can't be real," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Jason would never." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. I didn't want to hurt Sarah, but she deserved to know the truth. I'm going through the same thing with my wife. They've been seeing each other for months. Sarah looked up at me, her expression a mix of anger and heartbreak. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make sure they pay for what they've done," I said. "But I need your help." She hesitated, then nodded. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next hour, we laid out a plan. Sarah would confront Jason, but she wouldn't let on that she knew everything. Instead, she'd play the role of the dutiful wife, lulling him into a false sense of security. Meanwhile, I'd continue gathering evidence and preparing for the divorce. Together, we'd make sure Jason and Emily got exactly what they deserved. As I left the coffee shop, I felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back. Emily had made her choice, and now she was going to face the consequences. The days that followed were a blur of calculated moves and emotional turmoil. I moved out of the motel and into a small apartment I rented under a pseudonym. I couldn't risk Emily finding me, not yet. I needed to stay hidden, to work in the shadows until the time was right. Every morning, I woke up with a single thought. Today, I get closer to making her pay. Sarah and I stayed in close contact. She was a quick learner, and her anger toward Jason fueled her determination. She played her part perfectly, acting as though nothing was wrong while secretly gathering more evidence. She installed a keylogger on Jason's laptop, which gave us access to his emails and social media accounts. The more we uncovered, the more disgusted I became. Jason wasn't just cheating on Sarah with Emily, he had a history of affairs. He was a serial cheater, and Emily was just his latest victim. One evening, Sarah called me, her voice shaking with rage. "You need to see this," she said. "I just found something disturbing." I drove to her house where she handed me a stack of printed emails. They were between Jason and another woman, someone named Lisa. The emails were explicit, detailing their plans to meet at a hotel the following weekend. But what caught my attention was the date. It was the same weekend Emily had told me she was going on a work retreat. I felt a surge of anger, but also a strange sense of relief. Emily wasn't just cheating on me. She was being played by Jason, too. It was almost poetic. I looked at Sarah, who was pacing the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What are we going to do?" she asked. I thought for a moment, then smiled. "We're going to give them exactly what they want." The plan was simple but brutal. Sarah would confront Jason about the emails, but instead of leaving him, she'd pretend to forgive him. She'd suggest they go to marriage counseling and work on rebuilding their relationship. Meanwhile, I'd use the information we had to manipulate Emily into thinking Jason was about to leave her for Lisa. If everything went according to plan, Emily would confront Jason, and their little affair would blow up in their faces. The next day, I sent Emily an anonymous email from a fake account. It contained screenshots of Jason's emails with Lisa, along with a message, "He's using you. He's been seeing other women behind your back. If you don't believe me, ask him about the hotel this weekend." I didn't have to wait long for a response. That evening, Emily called me, her voice frantic. "Dan, I need to talk to you. It's important." I agreed to meet her at a park near our old house. When I arrived, she was already there, pacing back and forth. She looked like a mess. Her hair was unkempt and her eyes were red from crying. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "What's going on, Emily?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She handed me her phone, which was open to the email I'd sent her. "Did you send this?" she demanded. I pretended to read the email, then shook my head. "No, I didn't. But it looks like you've got a problem." She broke down then, sobbing uncontrollably. "I don't know what to do, Dan. I thought he loved me. I thought we had something real." I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. "You thought wrong," I said coldly. "Jason's a liar and a cheat. You're just one of many." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "What should I do?" I shrugged. "That's up to you. But if I were you, I'd confront him. Make him tell you the truth." She nodded, wiping her tears. "You're right. I need to know." I watched as she walked away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Part of me wanted to feel guilty for manipulating her like this, but the bigger part of me didn't care. She'd made her bed, and now she was going to lie in it. The next day, Sarah called me with an update. It worked, she said, sounding both relieved and exhausted. Emily confronted Jason and he admitted everything. They had a huge fight and he ended things with her. I felt a surge of satisfaction. "And what about you?" I asked. "I played my part," she said. I told him I forgave him, but I also made it clear that if he ever cheated again, I'd take the kids and leave him with nothing. "Good," I said. "You did the right thing." But I wasn't done yet. Emily had hurt me in the worst way possible, and I wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. I had one final move to make, and it was going to be the most devastating of all. The fallout from Emily's confrontation with Jason was swift and brutal. She called me the next day, her voice hollow and broken. "He ended it," she said, barely above a whisper. "He said it was just a fling, that he never loved me." I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to revel in her pain, to remind her that she'd brought this on herself. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the woman I'd fallen in love with, felt a pang of sympathy. I pushed it aside. Sympathy wouldn't get me what I wanted. "What are you going to do now?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She sighed, a sound so heavy it felt like it carried the weight of the world. "I don't know. I feel so lost. Dan, I'm so sorry for everything. I made a huge mistake." I clenched my jaw, fighting back the anger that threatened to spill over. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Emily. You broke us. You broke me." She started to cry, her sobs muffled by the phone. "I know. I don't expect you to forgive me. I wish I could take it all back." I didn't say what I was thinking. You can't. Instead, I told her we needed to talk in person. I had one last card to play, and I needed to see her face when I played it. We met at a quiet cafe downtown, the kind of place we used to go to on lazy Sunday mornings. Emily looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her hands trembled as she clutched a cup of coffee. I sat across from her, my expression unreadable. "Dan," she began, her voice shaky, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know how sorry I am. I was selfish and stupid, and I hurt you in the worst way possible. If there's any way I can make this right, please tell me." I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "You want to make it right?" She nodded eagerly, her eyes filled with hope. "Yes, anything." I reached into my bag and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it across the table to her. "Sign these." She frowned, opening the folder to reveal divorce papers. Her eyes scanned the document, widening as she realized what she was looking at. "Dan, I don't understand." "It's simple," I said, my voice cold. "You sign the papers and we end this, clean and simple." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, please, I don't want to lose you. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling, work through it." "There's nothing to fix," I interrupted. "You made your choice, Emily. Now it's time to face the consequences." She stared at me, her expression a mix of disbelief and desperation. "Dan, I love you. I always have. This thing with Jason, it was a mistake. It didn't mean anything." I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You don't get to say that to me, not after what you did. You don't get to rewrite history." She opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off. "Sign the papers, Emily, or I'll make this even harder for you." Her hands trembled as she picked up the pen. She hesitated, looking at me one last time, as if hoping I'd change my mind. I didn't. Finally, she signed her name, her tears smudging the ink. I took the papers and stood up, leaving her sitting there, broken and alone. As I walked out of the cafe, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, satisfaction, and a lingering sadness for what could have been. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. The days following the signing of the divorce papers were a whirlwind of legal formalities and emotional reckoning. I moved forward with the divorce proceedings, ensuring that Emily received nothing more than what she was legally entitled to, which, thanks to my earlier financial maneuvers, wasn't much. The house, the savings, even Max, our golden retriever, it all stayed with me. Emily tried to fight it at first, but her lawyer quickly realized she had no leg to stand on. The evidence of her infidelity was overwhelming, and the courts weren't kind to her. Emily moved out of our home and into a small apartment on the other side of town. She tried to reach out to me a few times, leaving voicemails and sending texts filled with apologies and pleas for reconciliation. I ignored them all. She had made her bed, and now she was lying in it, alone. But while I had won the battle, I couldn't shake the feeling that the war wasn't over. Emily's betrayal had left a scar on my soul, one that wouldn't heal easily. I threw myself into my work, burying my emotions under a mountain of projects and deadlines. My colleagues noticed the change in me. I was colder, more focused, less approachable, but I didn't care. I had no room for distractions, no time for weakness. Meanwhile, Sarah's situation took a different turn. She had confronted Jason about his affair with Emily, and while she had initially played the role of the forgiving wife, it didn't last long. The weight of his betrayal was too much for her to bear, and she eventually filed for divorce. Jason fought her tooth and nail, but Sarah had the upper hand. She had the evidence, the support of her family, and the determination to start over. In the end, Jason was left with nothing but his shattered reputation and a mountain of legal fees. Sarah and I stayed in touch, bonding over our shared experiences. We became unlikely allies, two people brought together by the pain of betrayal. She was strong, resilient, and fiercely independent, qualities I admired. Over time, our friendship deepened, and I found myself opening up to her in ways I hadn't with anyone else. She understood me in a way no one else could, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. But even as I began to rebuild my life, Emily's shadow loomed large. I couldn't escape the memories of our life together, the dreams we had shared, the future we had planned. I hated her for what she had done, but I also hated myself for still caring. I wanted to move on, to leave the past behind, but it wasn't that simple. One evening, as I was leaving work, I ran into Emily. She was waiting outside my office building, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Dan," she said, her voice trembling, "we need to talk." I hesitated, torn between the urge to walk away and the need to hear what she had to say. Finally, I nodded. "Fine, but make it quick." We went to a nearby park, sitting on a bench under the dim glow of a street lamp. Emily fidgeted with her hands, her eyes downcast. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she began, "but I need you to know how sorry I am. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realize now how much I hurt you. I was selfish and stupid, and I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me." I didn't respond, my jaw clenched as I stared straight ahead. She continued, her voice breaking. "I've been seeing a therapist, trying to figure out why I did what I did. I don't have all the answers yet, but I know I need to take responsibility for my actions. I hope one day you can find it in your heart to forgive me." I turned to look at her, my expression hard. "Forgiveness isn't something you can just ask for, Emily. It's something you earn, and right now, you haven't earned it." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to be better. I'm trying to fix myself." I stood up, unable to sit there any longer. "Good luck with that," I said, my voice cold, "but don't expect me to be a part of your journey." As I walked away, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a lingering sense of closure. Emily's apology had been sincere, but it didn't change what she had done. It didn't erase the pain she had caused. I knew I would carry that pain with me for the rest of my life, but I also knew I couldn't let it define me. The encounter with Emily left me unsettled. Her apology had been raw and genuine, but it didn't erase the past. I spent the next few days replaying the conversation in my head, trying to make sense of my feelings. Part of me wanted to believe she was truly remorseful, that she was on a path to becoming a better person. But the other part of me, the part that still carried the scars of her betrayal, couldn't let go of the anger. I didn't know if I ever would. During this time, Sarah became my anchor. She understood my turmoil because she was living it herself. We started spending more time together, not just as allies in our shared pain, but as friends. We'd meet for coffee or take long walks, talking about everything and nothing. She had a way of making me feel seen, of cutting through the walls I'd built around myself. It was refreshing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. One evening, Sarah invited me over for dinner. Her apartment was cozy, filled with the warmth of someone who had worked hard to rebuild their life. The smell of garlic and herbs wafted from the kitchen as she stirred a pot of pasta on the stove. I sat at the counter, watching her move with ease and confidence. "You're really good at this," I said, nodding toward the stove. She laughed, a sound that was light and carefree. "Cooking is my therapy. It's hard to be sad when you're eating something delicious." I smiled, feeling a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in months. "Well, I'm glad I get to be your taste tester." We ate dinner together, the conversation flowing effortlessly. We talked about our childhoods, our dreams, and the things we wanted to do now that we were free from the weight of our failed marriages. Sarah wanted to travel, to see the world and experience new cultures. I told her about my passion for photography, something I'd put on hold during my marriage to Emily. "You should pick it up again," Sarah said, her eyes lighting up. "You have a good eye. I remember the photos you showed me from your trip to Colorado. They were stunning." I shrugged, feeling a flicker of self-doubt. "It's been a while. I don't know if I still have it in me." She reached across the table, placing her hand on mine. "You do, and I think it would be good for you. Something just for you, you know." Her words stayed with me long after I left her apartment that night. The next day, I dug out my old camera from the back of my closet. It felt strange in my hands, like reconnecting with an old friend. I decided to take Sarah's advice and start shooting again. I began with small things, the way the light filtered through the trees in the park, the vibrant colors of a farmer's market, the quiet beauty of a sunrise. It was therapeutic, a way to channel my emotions into something creative. As the weeks passed, I found myself healing in ways I hadn't expected. The anger and bitterness that had consumed me began to fade, replaced by a sense of purpose and hope. I wasn't the same person I was before Emily's betrayal, and I didn't want to be. I was stronger now, more resilient, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living for myself, not for someone else. But just as I was starting to find my footing, Emily reappeared. She called me late one night, her voice frantic. "Dan, I need your help." I hesitated, my grip tightening on the phone. "What's wrong?" "It's Jason," she said, her voice trembling. "He's been harassing me, showing up at my apartment, calling me non-stop. I don't know what to do." I felt a surge of anger, not just at Jason, but at Emily for dragging me back into her mess. "Why are you calling me? You should call the police." "I did," she said, her voice breaking. "But they said they can't do anything unless he threatens me. Dan, I'm scared. I don't have anyone else to turn to." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I didn't know Emily anything, but I couldn't ignore the fear in her voice. "I'll see what I can do," I said finally. "But this is the last time, Emily. After this, you're on your own." I didn't want to get involved. Emily's problems were no longer my responsibility, and part of me wanted to hang up the phone and block her number. But the fear in her voice was real, and as much as I hated to admit it, I couldn't turn my back on her completely. Not when she was in genuine danger. The next day, I drove to Emily's apartment. She lived in a rundown complex on the edge of town, a far cry from the home we'd shared. When she opened the door, she looked even worse than the last time I'd seen her. Her eyes were hollow, her hair unkempt, and her hands trembled as she gestured for me to come inside. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know who else to call. I stepped inside, glancing around the small, cluttered space. It was a stark contrast to the life she'd had with me, and for a moment, I felt a pang of pity, but I quickly pushed it aside. "What's going on with Jason?" I asked, getting straight to the point. She sank onto the couch, wrapping her arms around herself. "He's been calling me non-stop, saying he wants to talk. He showed up here last night, banging on the door and yelling. I didn't let him in, but he wouldn't leave. I had to call the police, but by the time they got here, he was gone. I frowned, my mind racing. Jason had always been a manipulative jerk, but this was a new level of crazy. Have you talked to Sarah? I asked. She should know what's going on. Emily shook her head. I don't want to drag her into this. She's been through enough because of me. I couldn't argue with that. Sarah had already suffered enough because of Jason and Emily's affair. She didn't need this added stress. All right, I said, sitting down across from her. Tell me everything. When did this start? What's he saying? Over the next hour, Emily filled me in on the details. Jason had been trying to contact her for weeks, begging her to meet him. He claimed he was sorry, that he wanted to make things right. But when she refused, his tone turned aggressive. He started showing up at her apartment, leaving voicemails filled with threats and accusations. It was clear he was spiraling, and Emily was terrified. I don't know what to do, she said, tears streaming down her face. I just want him to leave me alone. I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees. You need to get a restraining order, and you need to document everything, every call, every text, every time he shows up here. The more evidence you have, the better. She nodded, wiping her tears. Will you help me? I don't know how to do this. I hesitated. Helping Emily meant reopening old wounds, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. But the look in her eyes, the sheer desperation, made it impossible to say no. I'll help you, I said finally. But this is it, Emily. After this, you're on your own. Over the next few days, I helped Emily file for a restraining order and gather evidence against Jason. It was exhausting, both emotionally and mentally, but I kept my focus on the task at hand. I didn't want to think about the past or what this meant for my own healing. I just wanted to get it over with. Meanwhile, I kept Sarah in the loop. She deserved to know what was happening, especially since Jason's behavior could potentially put her at risk, too. She was understandably upset, but grateful that I was helping Emily. You're a better person than I am, she said one evening over the phone. I don't think I could have done what you're doing. I'm not doing it for her, I admitted. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. The restraining order was granted, but it didn't stop Jason. If anything, it made him more determined. He started showing up at Emily's workplace, causing scenes that got her in trouble with her boss. She was on the verge of losing her job, and her mental health was deteriorating rapidly. It was clear that something had to be done. One night, I got a call from Emily. She was hysterical, barely able to form coherent sentences. He's here, she sobbed. He's outside my apartment, screaming and banging on the door. Dan, I'm scared. I grabbed my keys and headed to her apartment, my heart pounding. When I arrived, Jason was standing outside her door, his face red with rage. He turned to me as I approached, his eyes wild. Stay out of this, Dan, he snarled. This is between me and Emily. No, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. This ends now. You need to leave or I'm calling the police. He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. You think you're so tough, don't you? You think you've won? Well, guess what? You're just as pathetic as she is. I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Jason's expression shifted from anger to panic as he realized I was serious. He took a step back, then another, before finally turning and walking away. I watched him go, my hands shaking. It wasn't until the police arrived that I allowed myself to breathe. Emily opened the door, her face pale and tear-streaked. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. It's over, I said. He won't bother you again. The confrontation with Jason marked a turning point, not just for Emily, but for me as well. Seeing him unravel like that, his anger, his desperation, was a stark reminder of how destructive betrayal could be. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about the lies, the manipulation, the way he had torn apart 2 marriages without a second thought. And while I had no sympathy for him, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. He was out of our lives for good, and that was all that mattered. Emily, however, was a different story. The incident had left her shaken, and she leaned on me more than I was comfortable with. She called me constantly, asking for advice, for reassurance, for anything that would help her feel safe again. I tried to be patient, to remind myself that she was still dealing with the fallout of her choices, but it was exhausting. I had my own life to rebuild, my own wounds to heal, and I couldn't keep carrying her baggage. One evening, after another long day of fielding her calls, I met Sarah for dinner. She could tell something was bothering me the moment I sat down. "You look tired," she said, her brow furrowed with concern. "What's going on?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Emily, she's a lot. I know she's struggling, but I can't keep being her emotional crutch. It's not fair to me." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've done more for her than most people would. But you're right. You can't keep putting her needs above your own. You need to set boundaries." "I know," I said, staring down at my plate. "But every time I try, she guilt trips me. She says she has no one else, that she's all alone." Sarah reached across the table, placing her hand on mine. "She's not your responsibility, Dan. You've already given her more than she deserves. It's okay to walk away." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. She was right. I had spent so much time trying to fix things, to make up for Emily's mistakes, that I had forgotten to take care of myself. I needed to let go, not just of Emily, but of the guilt and anger that had been weighing me down. The next time Emily called, I answered with a newfound resolve. "Emily, we need to talk," I said before she could launch into her usual litany of worries. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Okay," she said hesitantly. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything that's happened. And while I'm glad I could help you with Jason, I can't keep doing this. I need to focus on my own life, on moving forward. And I think you need to do the same." She was silent for a long moment, and I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. "Are you saying you don't want to talk to me anymore?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm saying I need space," I replied, my tone firm but gentle. "You've got to figure things out on your own, Emily. I can't keep being your lifeline." There was another pause, and then she sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. "I understand," she said quietly. I'm sorry, Dan, for everything." "I know," I said, "and I forgive you. But forgiveness doesn't mean we go back to the way things were. It just means we let go." We hung up shortly after, and I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a sense of finality. It was over. The chapter of my life that had been defined by Emily, by our marriage and its painful end, was finally closed. I could move on, and move on I did. Over the next few months, I threw myself into my photography, turning it from a hobby into a passion. I started posting my work online, and to my surprise, it gained a following. People connected with the raw emotion in my photos, the way I captured light and shadow, joy and pain. It was cathartic, a way to express everything I had been feeling without having to say a word. Sarah was my biggest supporter. She encouraged me to enter contests, to host exhibitions, to push myself beyond my comfort zone. And as my career began to take off, our friendship deepened. We spent more and more time together, sharing meals, going on weekend trips, and just enjoying each other's company. It was easy, natural, and for the first time in a long time, I felt happy. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. One evening, as Sarah and I were having dinner at her place, she dropped a bombshell. "I'm moving," she said, her voice steady but her eyes filled with emotion. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. "What? Where? Why?" She smiled a little sadly. "I got a job offer in Seattle. It's a great opportunity, and I think it's time for a fresh start. But I'll miss you." I set my fork down, my mind racing. Seattle was on the other side of the country. If she left, our easy, comfortable dynamic would change, and I wasn't ready for that. "When do you leave?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "In a month," she said. "I wanted to tell you sooner, but I didn't know how." I nodded, trying to process the news. "I'll miss you too," I said finally, "but I'm happy for you. You deserve this." She reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. "You'll come visit, right?" I smiled, though it felt bittersweet. "Of course. And who knows? Maybe I'll even take some photos of the Pacific Northwest." We spent the rest of the evening talking about her plans, about the future, about everything except the one question that lingered in the back of my mind. What would my life look like without her in it? Sarah's announcement hit me harder than I expected. Over the weeks that followed, I found myself grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. I was happy for her, of course. She deserved this opportunity, this chance to start fresh and build a new life for herself. But at the same time, the thought of her leaving filled me with a sense of loss I hadn't anticipated. We spent as much time together as we could before her move. We explored the city, visited our favorite spots, and even took a weekend trip to the coast. It was bittersweet, every moment tinged with the knowledge that our time together was running out. But it was also beautiful, a reminder of how far we'd both come and how much we'd helped each other heal. One evening, as we sat on the beach watching the sunset, Sarah turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" she asked, her voice soft. I frowned, unsure of what she meant. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I mean, if things had been different, if we'd met under different circumstances, do you think we could have been more than friends?" Her question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The truth was I had thought about it, more than I cared to admit, but I had always pushed those thoughts aside, telling myself that our friendship was too important to risk. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe, but we can't change the past, Sarah. All we can do is move forward." She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "You're right, and I'm glad we're moving forward together, even if it's just for a little while longer." Her words stayed with me long after we left the beach that night. I couldn't stop thinking about what she had said, about the possibility of something more between us. But I didn't know if I was ready to take that step, to open myself up to the risk of getting hurt again. The day of Sarah's departure came too quickly. I helped her pack up her apartment, loading boxes into a moving truck and making sure everything was ready for the long drive to Seattle. When the time came to say goodbye, I felt a lump form in my throat. "I'm going to miss you," I said, pulling her into a tight hug. She hugged me back, her arms warm and familiar. "I'll miss you too, Dan. But this isn't goodbye, it's just, see you later." I nodded, forcing a smile. "See you later." As I watched her drive away, I felt a strange mix of emotions, sadness, pride, and a lingering sense of what if. But I didn't have time to dwell on it. Life went on, and so did I. Without Sarah around, I threw myself into my photography with even more determination. I started working on a new project, a series of portraits capturing the resilience of people who had overcome adversity. It was challenging, but also incredibly rewarding. And as my work gained more recognition, I began to feel a sense of fulfillment I hadn't experienced in years. But even as my career flourished, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. I missed Sarah, her laughter, her wisdom, her unwavering support. We stayed in touch, of course, texting and calling regularly, but it wasn't the same as having her there, in person. Months passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. I was content, but not quite happy. And then, one day, everything changed. I was preparing for an exhibition of my work when I got a call from Sarah. Her voice was filled with excitement, and I could tell something big had happened. "Dan, you'll never guess what," she said, barely able to contain herself. "What?" I asked, smiling at her enthusiasm. "I got offered a job back in Austin," she said. "It's an amazing opportunity, and I'm coming home." My heart leapt at her words, a surge of joy I hadn't felt in a long time. "That's incredible, Sarah. I'm so happy for you." "I'm happy too," she said, her voice softening. "But there's something else I need to tell you." I frowned, sensing the shift in her tone. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since I moved to Seattle. About us, about what I said that night on the beach. And I realized I don't want to wonder what might have been anymore. I want to know. I want to try. Her words left me speechless. For a moment, all I could do was stare at the phone, my mind racing. Sarah. I began, but she cut me off. You don't have to say anything right now, she said quickly. I just needed you to know how I feel. I'll be back in Austin in a few weeks, and we can talk more then. But whatever happens, I want you to know that you mean the world to me. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. You mean the world to me too, Sarah. And I think I'm ready to find out what might have been. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then she laughed, a sound filled with relief and joy. I'll see you soon, Dan. As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't felt in years. Sarah was coming home, and with her, the possibility of a new beginning. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay.